Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's C-O-M-B-E-S-T, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?
Hi, it's me, Egbert, E-G-G-B-U-R-T, the owner of this radio station. I invite everyone to listen, no matter if you're young, old, black, white, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, heck, I even want real estate agents listening to my station. Yes, even Rick and Tracy. You're all welcome. Now, it's back to my Goodwill ambassadors, Brad and John.
Bing, bing, bong, bing. Bing, bing, bong, bong, bing, bing.
Every time I hear that, cracks me up. Did you hear that, John?
I did not. What is it?
And let me play that back again. I played, so I'll put you in so you can hear it. Ready?
Bing, bing, bong, bing. Bing, bing, bong, bong, bing, bing.
You know who that is?
What is that from?
That's Trump.
Oh, no way. I'm not familiar with that one.
Yes, he's a couple of his speeches. He goes on. He's talking about how things work. Bing, bing, bong. Bing, 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 bong. It's pretty funny stuff. Okay. Something interesting, and speaking of Trump, you and I have touched on this a couple times this week, and this is actually starting to really take on some traction. The controversy of CBS News. And we talked about this. I can't remember this guy's name. He's on the morning. You had it the other day. Tony.
Yeah, we looked him up. He's got a funny last name. It's like some kind of ethnic last name.
Tony Oompa Loompa or something like that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Tony Oompa Loompa.
Tony Oompa Loompa. Okay. He's a Jewish gentleman. And I guess it was Monday, he interviewed a black gentleman who's written a somewhat controversial book about the fact that the Jews are essentially suppressing the Palestinians, and they're essentially creating apartheid. And if you know what apartheid was, that goes back to South Africa, when the minority people who were in South Africa who were white, and the majority of people in South Africa were black, and this is the whole Nelson Mandela thing. The white people ruled the country, and the blacks had no say-so. Okay, this is essentially the parallel that this author's making. And Tony Oompa Loompa asked what I thought was a good question, and it's blown up into the situation like, oh my God, OMG. And they had a all-call conference call, which was supposedly confidential, and somebody recorded it, and they've put that up online. And you hear the two of the head lady who's head running for CBS News found lots of problems with what Tony did, and the other lady did, and yet their number one legal correspondent, disagreed and said he was just being a good journalist. But of course, we don't have good journalists anymore. Trump yesterday came out and said, which is actually sort of funny, that the FCC should take away CBS's license. He's saying that their license should be revoked. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Technically, CBS doesn't have a license because you don't necessarily, and this is sort of complicated, but you don't necessarily have to have a quote-unquote broadcast license, because the network itself is really not broadcasting anything. It's their affiliates. In town here, it's Channel 4, KMOV. And if you remember, back in the day, the infamous Super Bowl thing with Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake, where part of her costume fell off or was pulled off by Justin Timberlake at the end of a routine in halftime, as end of one of her songs, and exposed one of her breasts. The FCC fined the affiliates. They fined the affiliates for essentially transmitting pornography. I think that's what they actually got nailed for, and a nudity or unapproved nudity, stuff like that. And the affiliates were like, hey, wasn't our fault. We're just running what the network says. But this is the way it works, is that if I were turn on the John Combest network this morning, and let's go a year into the future, and John has moved on from the BJ show, and John is now on 500 stations syndicated around the country. If I'm running the John Combest show and John drops, if he says, hey, I don't like this guy, and let me tell you, F you, and he uses the two words on the air, it's me who, as the licensee of the station, who gets nailed. It's not John Combest. It's not.
Whoa, what a plan. I smell a plot coming up. Go ahead, Brad.
It's not the John Combest Network. It's me, the licensee of the stations. And essentially, what and I can't get this lady's name right. She's the new chief of the FCC. She essentially came out yesterday and said, we are now not going to take any action against CBS or any of their affiliates, any of their affiliates for political talk, which we deem to be I can't remember exact words, unapproachable or something like that. In other words, she's essentially saying, hey, look, this is political talk, and we're not going to go after anybody because of the fact of what they said. And I've told you the story that if you, as John Combest was running for office, and you showed up at my doorstep and you said, Brad, I've filled out the forms. Here's the NAB form that I need to do for you to get my ad on the air. Here's the contract for the advertising. Here's my ad. And John gives me an ad, and it starts out with, F you, F you, F you. I have to run that ad. I can't turn it down. And that trumps, no pun intended, that trumps the FCC rules and regulations on obscenity. Because you are a political candidate, you can say anything. You can say, you could start talking about the fact that you think that Vladimir Putin should be brought over to the United States and be our new president. You could say anything. And legally, I can't do anything. Now, what's interesting about that is, let's go back to the CBS thing. What Trump is also upset about is, we talked about this, I don't know if it was yesterday or Wednesday, with the CBS 60 Minutes interview that Kamala Harris did, which has been re-edited, and there's two versions of a question. Bill Whitaker asks her a question, and in the one version that's out there, she gives one answer, and in another version, he asks the exact same question, and she gets a different answer. Trump is saying CBS did that on purpose. And you know what? Can I be honest with you?
Yeah.
I agree with him.
Yeah. And isn't the controversy of why don't they just release the transcript?
Well, that here we go again. That is the issue, is that not necessarily the transcript, just release the unedited recordings. In other words, they put her in the studio, and somebody ran the recorder, and the recorder ran the entire length of the interview. Release that so we can see where the edits were made. Years ago, this goes back to my college days. I always talk about my one professor, Dr. Camille Winter, but I don't talk too much about John Mormon, who was an interesting character as well, too. He talked about the fact that this is going way, 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 way back about fighting news bias, is that he talked about there were groups, and when you think about this is sort of amazing because this was way before everybody have a camera on their phone. He said that what the smart people are doing, and this is like a long time ago, they're sending their own person to run a recording of the interview being recorded by whoever is doing the interview, the interviewers. In other words,
it's a valuable technique.
Right. If you're being interviewed on Channel 4 and you go down to the studios, I was going to say in downtown, they moved out to Maryland Heights now. If they're in Maryland Heights and let's say you're a campaign coordinator, or you're what would be like the title for the head campaign dude? Who is that? What do you call that? Campaign manager or campaign?
Yeah, like a campaign manager, comms director.
Comms director. Okay. You would sit there in the studio with your little iPhone or Android phone and record the interview on your iPhone. That way, if you've got essentially proof, the fact that if they edit to make your candidate look like poop, you can go back and say, okay, hold on a minute. Here's the entire interview. Look what they did. He asked question A, my candidate gave answer A, but yet you put in, my candidate's answer B, which had nothing to do with A, but it made him look bad, which essentially what Trump is saying, but he's saying the opposite. He's saying CBS is doing this to make Harris look good. You know what? I have no doubt that's what they're doing. I mean, I'm not trying to be...
Yeah, of course, or else they would put the entire interview. And, as a good example, who does this well locally is Mark Maxwell from KSDK. You can see on Channel 5, like a tightly edited version because they have to edit it for time on his show on the record. But then Maxwell and company put the entire interview up on the KSTK website if you want to watch the whole thing. And now, granted, most people who are going to watch the whole thing are kind of nitpickers like me and, policy people who are looking for gotcha moments. But why not put the whole thing up, Brad? And the answer is they want to cover for Kamala Harris.
Well, John, let's be honest. This whole controversy with and once again, I watched the interview with Tony Oompa Loompa, and once again, you would think that Tony was throwing hatchets at the guy, like you would, like you go to the place where you do the hatchet throwing, the axe throwing. You would think he's throwing axes at the guy, and he was setting his pants on fire when he was doing part of the interview. It's a very civil sit-down interview. And the only thing they're claiming, this is the whole thing, they're claiming that Tony Oompa Loompa, who is Jewish, and supposedly he's divorced and his wife and his kids moved back to Israel, they're saying that his personal bias is responsible for this interview not meeting the standards of CBS News. Let's think about that for a minute. Remember, and I'm not trying to grind my axe, but remember we had J.D. Vance during the CBS vice presidential debate, and remember the rules were there would be no fact-checking. And what happened during the CBS debate with
there
Walls?
Was fact-checking.
There was fact-checking. And Vance essentially said, he called them out. And he says, because the big one was where he's talking about the people in Ohio. What's the town? Springfield, Ohio. Isn't that the town where everybody's...
Yeah, where they're eating the cats.
Eating cats, eating the dogs and things like that. And was it Margaret Brennan or was it Nora O'Donnell who came back and said, well, it's been proven that there's a lot of legal immigrants that live in Springfield, Ohio as well, too. It's fact-checking, Once again, they said they weren't going to do it. And she can't help herself. They can't help themselves. And
they're rooting for the home team.
John, going back 10 years, I personally witnessed this in Ferguson. I personally witnessed this where I saw reporters who would get on the air, and I'm not going to call out any one reporter. I will tell you what network is. I stood there and I watched this person do a rap, as they call it, and this was live on CNN. And when this particular person got off the air, they started spouting exactly opposite what they just said on the air, because they were on the protester side, and they made it clear that to the people standing around, they were on the protester side. So once again, it's to the point where to me it's so frustrating that this is the norm nowadays. And it's God, if Camille Winter were alive today, if he's dead, I don't know how long he's been dead, 10, 15 years, something like that. Somebody could put a tachometer on his grave, and if he were aware of what's going on in the journalistic or so-called journalistic. And the problem with this is that some people say, well, what's wrong with that? The problem is this is Russian control. This is how the Russian people are controlled. The news agency is owned by the Russian government. Same thing in China.
State media. Yeah,
right.
That's why we call NPR state media, because they're funded by the government to tell the government side of the story.
Right. And essentially you only hear one side of the story, which is the official side of the story that the government gave. I'm off my soapbox, John. Any comments you want to make on that?
No. I think it's, people vote with money. They vote with their dollars. And then when it comes to attention, people vote with their clicks and where they look. I don't think most reasonable people would look at St. Louis Public Radio in 2024 the way they would look at it in 1999. I think it's a different view on, and I think more people are, numbers show that people are more willing to recognize blatant media left-wing bias than they were 25 years ago, because it wasn't as pronounced back then. And you and I have both lived through it, Brad. You for longer than I have. But I remember the days where, the Post-Dispatch, I'm going to sound like an old guy here, but the Post-Dispatch was Joe Mannis and was, these veteran reporters who were seeking the truth and not seeking to use little weasel words to put their own opinions in a story.
Well, that goes back to my complaint, and this is ancient history, John, and maybe I'll just put this out there, and you probably know about this, which has always bothered me. There was a group of retired reporters from the Post-Dispatch who started their own news site. What was it called? The Beacon? Remember that? Do you remember
the Beacon, the St. Louis Beacon.
The St. Louis Beacon, okay. And these were retired reporters, and probably, I think most of them were ex-Post-Dispatch employees. Wasn't that the deal?
And a couple Globe Democrat hangers on too, I think.
Right. Bunch of retired newspaper reporters. They did it like out of passion. I don't know if they were making any money. NPR hired the entire staff. Remember that?
I do. Yeah. The St. Louis Public Radio acquired the Beacon, and that's how Joe Manis came to St. Louis Public Radio.
Right. And I'm going like, okay, hold on a minute. Let's think about this for a minute. They go out and they hire an entire staff of another news organization, and they bring them into their organization. And I'm going like, okay, once again, they were perfectly fine doing their own little thing on their own, the Beacon, the Independent, and all of a sudden they're now state employees and they're getting paid by the state, they're getting a pension, they're getting this, they're getting that. I got a problem with that. I really do. And the problem.
What's the nature of the problem?
They're on the state dole.
Oh, I get it. So it's not the fact that they got acquired. It's more that you're taking this kind of nonprofit retiree entity and saying, hey, do you want to join the state payroll and get state benefits and be a university employee?
Well,
I get what you're saying.
See, it frustrates me to no end because sometimes every week on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, I have to deal with different governmental agencies. And for the most part, it's never fun. And it's to the point where you get treated like it's like calling Ameren UE. Okay, if it were a profit organization, you would be treated differently. It's like I had a situation years ago, and I don't want to hear where I sound like I'm grinding my axe. I had a situation years ago where I'm dealing, and you got to call the stupid main number, and you got to go through the stupid phone tree. And I asked the one person, I said, can you give me a direct dial number for this person? Oh, no, nobody has a direct dial number. Well, the part of that, this BS, is first off, in a corporate world, do you believe nobody has a direct dial number, John? I mean, like...
Oh, of course. They certainly have a direct dial number. They don't want to give it out to you.
Right.
They don't want you to call them directly.
Right. It's like John Combest. You can't get his phone number, and he'll never tell you. But it's and I think to myself, and I said this lady, I said, I have a friend of mine that works at Ameren UE. I have his direct dial number. So don't tell me nobody has direct dial numbers. Well, it depends on what department they're in. I want to talk to somebody, I was talking to somebody in management. Okay. No, can't do that. Okay. What is that? And it used to be in the point where you could show up at their doors. Now you can't even do that anymore because the doors are locked because of COVID. Everybody's got their doors locked. They still lock the doors. Drives me nuts.
Well, and they have the doors locked because Brad Hildebrand types will get frustrated being lost in a phone tree for 45 minutes and be like, you know what? I'm just going to drive there and make them deal with me. We can't have that, Brad.
Right. And especially if they're government employees and they'll refer to themselves as, like, it always cracks me up when Joe Biden talks about, I'm a public servant. Okay, let's go back to the old days when the servants lived in a little tiny house behind the big house where the boss lived. Get what I'm saying?
I do. That's very imperialistic of you. And we're getting close, Brad. Speaking of white men taking over, we're getting close to Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday.
Is that Columbus Day?
Well, that's what you might call it if you're up eating a nice meal on Dago Hill. But here in a diverse part of town, we call it Indigenous Peoples Day, Brad.
Okay.
Now, I think we should serve the indigenous people by actually doing a show on Monday, and we can pay some homage to indigenous folks.
So that's a federal holiday on Monday, correct?
I believe it. Yeah, it is.
Oh, God. Here we go again. Don't get me going on this. I mean,
I'm going to get you going on it, Brad.
Okay, we need to take a break before my blood pressure rises to over 200, like every once in a while it does.
Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's Combest, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of The Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?